Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm L Shawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching.
Today we are no longer going to dance around the topic of spirituality. We will engage with it and try to kind of find a pathway through the conversation related to spirituality by one, talking about how that might show up in coaching practice, and then two, how it might show up for L Shawn and me. And spirituality is something that is a broad term. And the way that I define it is just, I kind of look at the spiritual source that gives someone meaning, whether that is through a traditional religion or through nature or through something else. I often find people really relate to spirituality when they think about like interstellar things as well. So spirituality is a very broad term, and we're coming at it today from a broad term because we work with people who walk so many different paths in their life. So L Shawn, let's just start here, and maybe we can start with the coaching lens to begin, how spirituality shows up for you in coaching, and maybe some best practices around how you work with someone and their spiritual development in coaching.
I think that the positive intelligence framework has some spiritual elements to it. When we are looking at the true self, or the part of us that has inner wisdom, that has spiritual tones. I know that positive intelligence leans more towards a more neutral or maybe even secular framework. Anyone can apply the framework to their lives. I do believe that there is room for spirituality. And when I think about the way that we interact with the idea of the sage, which is the part of ourselves or the personification of our true self, and it has these 5 powers, which are all of the, I would say, positive traits that we all humans have: empathy, innovation, exploration, which has curiosity, and navigation, which is our values. And then we have activation, which is taking action, doing things. That speaks to productivity. When we interact with the sage, it's not on an intellectual level. Almost all of the visualizations and the activities that we use to tap into the sage, I would say, is a more metaphysical, spiritual activity. Visualizing the sage, talking to the wiser elder self, the inner child. Those are things that require imagination, and they're a little bit more on the spiritual side. So I would say just the framework that I use, the positive intelligence framework that I use, has some undertones of spirituality. As a coach, when I work with my clients, we talk to each other before we enter into an agreement. And if it comes up, if my client brings it up, I'm religious, or I'm spiritual, or spirituality is important to me, those are some questions that I might ask in an intake, like what's your values are, what's important to you, and then it comes up. And I also listen to my clients. I see how they're navigating certain situations. I never bring it up unless it comes up by the client, because it's really up to the client to bring that up. And I respect whatever faith or spiritual identity that my client has, whatever it is. I am completely neutral, non-judgmental, and I work with the client in their framework. If it's something that I'm not familiar with, I might ask a question and be curious about it so that I can better serve the client. And it really is led by the client. When that comes up in the appointment, I usually follow and mirror back, do all those things that we do as coaches. And I find that when spirituality and faith and religion come up in appointments, these come up when my client is dealing with situations that are maybe out of their control or that are bigger than them. They usually show up in those times. And I would say they show up for me also. I often rely on my own spirituality, my own beliefs, faith, that kind of thing, when things are bigger than I can comprehend, and I'm able to accept, hey, I don't understand this. I'm not sure how this is going to turn out, but I have faith that it's going to be in a way that's going to be good for everyone involved, or that, and the idea that there's something bigger, like a bigger picture. How about you, Eryn? How does spirituality show up in your coaching, and how do you approach it as a coach?
Yeah, I liked a lot of what you said. So I want to come back to this idea of faith and holding something bigger. Please help me remember to revisit that. Really, it shows up in my coaching practice because it often is a big question in grief and loss, right? People start to look at their values a little bit differently sometimes, which then might lead to looking at spirituality a little bit different. Not always, but it can happen. And so I created the Bloom Path, which is a diagram that has 13 different touch points that your grief and loss might have with you and outside of you. There's 6 internal blooms and 7 external blooms. And one of the internal is spirituality. And so when I go through this Bloom Path diagram, I explain what each of these mean. And I do it pretty briefly, just so that the client can have like a springboard to starting to explore where they want to explore. And some people do jump to that spirituality piece, while other people start and focus on identity, or other people might start and focus on their familial relationships. So it's all over the place in terms of where people draw spirituality into their grief and loss process. And I talk about this in my book that's coming up. And for me personally, I talk about my experiences with, as you mentioned, the unknown, and the the spiritual happenings that kind of awakened me to new beliefs and new ways of living, that I don't think I would have encountered or been open to encountering prior to some of these experiences in my life. So I touch on those as well. And then your point on this faith to let things open up, I love this point because in coaching, we often tend to be very directed in terms of we're focusing on a goal and we're trying to make movement to, create some shifts in our life. And I think sometimes that is really well balanced with this faith that we can trust the process. We don't have to push full speed ahead on certain things, and we can let things unfold. So I like spirituality sometimes as a way to look at how people can let, life lead them rather than them trying to lead life. And that can look very different in how people think about that for themselves. Some may relate to it to the natural world and its changing, ever changing seasons and order of things, whereas others draw from a more traditional faith background. But the point is, I think, is it does open us up to exploring things more open-heartedly and not in such a kind of blindly directed way where we're kind of not paying attention to what's unfolding around us. So I like that opening up concept too. And I think with coaching as a professional coach, we can help our clients be open to both of those things. The opening to what life is showing them, but also the tending to that and the micro goals and the micro steps to get to where you want to be, to get closer to the meaning you're making in life and those sorts of things. So it's both combining that art and science of coaching when we draw this concept in. Well, Shawn, did you want to add anything else about coaching practice before we move into personal?
I like that you brought up the idea of helping our clients be open to, shifts and those things that are happening with spirituality. and faith. And I think as a coach, I do tend to defer to my clients when it comes to religion, faith, spirituality, partly because it can be a sensitive topic. I think it does require a gentle touch or a way to approach it as a perspective in a situation, or certain beliefs that are influencing a situation, or how the client is approaching a problem, or how they're approaching a person and something like that. But I do like the idea of partnering with the client to open their mind, or to explore differences in their perspective, depending on what they're going through. As you spoke with grief and loss specifically, there are changes that happen. And so I do like the idea of partnering with the client in being open to changes around spirituality and faith and religion. So I liked that. I didn't think about that before, but that really does challenge me as a coach to maybe expand more on this concept rather than being passive, maybe being more proactive, and maybe asking questions that can help expand my client's perspective based on what's happening in the moment. Again, wanting to make sure that it's appropriate, and that it adds value to the appointment, rather than just, oh, let me touch on all the perspectives, and I need to touch on spirituality. But if it's not relevant and not appropriate in the moment, then maybe not do that. But I do like the idea of being more proactive as a coach. And I don't know if I misinterpreted that, but that's kind of how I interpreted it. And if so, you can go ahead and add or clarify. But that's kind of how I interpreted it, as being more proactive as a coach, but not in a leading way, but in a way that's, hey, we're going to be partners, and let's explore different options here, and let's not leave certain, stones unturned because of a sense that it might be too sensitive, or that's me. That's my ideas coming in, actually. But I do like the idea of being more proactive in this topic.
I think you captured that correctly in how I was, or not even the word correctly. I think you captured that in how I was referring to it. And it is like that openness, and there's no one way of thinking about it, or even that's the one thing that I want to add here too. Like, while you and I both maybe have our own spiritual beliefs, it's about suspending those for ourselves too, and being very aware of that, to be open to what's unfolding for the individual themselves. It's this kind of art of coaching. I put it in the art of coaching space in some ways, but I think being open to it does make a lot of sense. And, as coaches, we're open to challenging topics with our clients, and hard topics, and explorative conversations, and those types of things, to help them make meaning from their own lens. So yeah, I think that it does make sense sometimes to ask the question. I think it's very dependent on the situation, but yeah, it does come up, and it does come up a lot in my space, just because of the grief and loss world. Whereas I'm sure in your coaching space, it might look quite a bit different. So that's also where some difference lies as well. Maybe we can shift a little bit into personal experiences with spirituality, and anything we want to add there. I will say that in my master's program in education, there was a little bit, in some ways, of a renewed interest in this topic of spirituality, and how it has a touch point with education, how it has a touch point in other areas of life. And I really started to get engaged in Parker Palmer's work, and Carrie Newcomer as well, and just kind of their messages. They both come from more of a Christian lens. Carrie Newcomer is Quaker, and then I'm not quite sure of Parker Palmer's faith tradition in the Christian realm. But he put on these institutes for the courage to teach, the courage to practice law. And both of them are very social justice minded individuals. And they open me up to a new way of kind of thinking about that from a lens of how social justice can be paired with these faiths, um, with thoughtfulness, non-judgment, not to proselytize, all of those things, but to create more meaning, to open oneself up to the unknown, to live a more peaceful, caring life, those sorts of things. That's what was really coming up for me when I was studying their work, well, Parker Palmer's work in particular in the class that I was in. And mind you, this was at, a state school. So it's not like it was at a religious school. But I think that was where I started to be a little bit more open to what I was experiencing in relationship to my own career and spirituality, which those two often don't come together very well. So what about you, LaShawn? Do you have an introductory start point like that after maybe deconstructing some faith in the past?
Interestingly, it hasn't really come up that much in my career. A lot of what I focused on in my career was motivation and learning, like how do we learn? What's the best way to present material when we're teaching? Because my background is in second language acquisition. So a lot of it was that. And then, of course, because I was teaching English as a foreign or second language, identity, because you mentioned social justice, identity came up a lot, where we want to honor the learner's identity. And what's interesting is that religion and spirituality, that didn't really come up in the discussions of the learner's identity. It was more having to do with more social or nationality kind of. And I taught Japanese learners. And what's interesting about the landscape, the learning landscape in Japan is that I would say it's fairly secular. Although what's interesting is I did teach at two religious institutions. I taught at a Catholic women's school, and then I taught at I don't know what denomination it is, but a Christian private college in Osaka. So even though it was a Christian college, so we got Christmas off and that kind of thing, and in other Japanese universities that wouldn't even been a thing, but because I taught at a Christian university and I taught at a Catholic women's college, we got Christmas off, which was nice as an American, having that as a normal thing for me to have Christmas off to spend with family. It didn't really come up. So that's what's really interesting. As on a personal level, that's something that I fall back on when things get to be too much. And this brings back what you said about faith and holding something bigger, which you can talk more about later. But that's usually when religion, spirituality, faith comes up for me. My journey started with being raised in a Mormon church, in the Mormon church. So it's very different from other denominations, but it's Christian, but there's some mysticism and other things going on there. It's not your typical Christian religion, but I was raised that. And so the way that it showed up for me when I was being brought up with those values, family was important, charity, compassion, love, forgiveness, those things were all taught and expected. And those were things that I really focused on in my journey. I tend to have conversations with other people in my life and also in in a professional way, just in acknowledging people's different religious beliefs or faith. And I think that also comes into the lens of one thing that's very big in the nonprofit sector right now, and in a lot of sectors, is diversity, equity, and inclusion, where the training that is involved in that is recognizing and also acknowledging that people have different religious beliefs and faith and spirituality, and honoring that and making room for that. But I will say, on the flip side, there is a lot of, for me, hesitation to talk about it. I feel like people can be very, I want to say, sensitive about certain beliefs, what's right, what's wrong. It gets into morality, it gets into, how you raise your children, the certain things that are okay to talk about and things that are not okay to talk about. And so having an honest and open conversation about spirituality, faith, religion has been, I would say, a little risky because how do you bring it up? And if you do bring it up, what's the best way to bring it up? I usually let the other person bring it up because I feel like it's very personal and I don't want to encroach on their privacy. However, I do feel like it's very important to talk about. I do think that it's such a big part of who we are, whether it's how do you navigate disasters? How do you navigate grief and loss? How do you navigate change? How do you navigate parenting? That's all going to come into the realm of spirituality, beliefs, values. I don't think it's something that we should avoid, but I do often, struggle with how do I bring this up? How do I talk about this? How about you, Eryn? Any thoughts coming up for you?
It was almost like this pinpoint aha moment that I don't really know yet what the aha is. But when you said spirituality along with beliefs and values, and I was just like, well, in coaching, we talk about values and beliefs all the time, right? And we rarely talk about spirituality as part of that combination. And so you're right, it is a hard thing to bring up. And it makes a lot of sense as to why one would not, given everyone's, personal preferences and the way people have been persecuted for their beliefs or whatever it may be. And so it's a lot easier to say these are my values sometimes than what that is, maybe in the larger context. So I hear you. I struggle with this part of the conversation all the time. And I am not very good at it, I must say. But the book that I'm putting out, I'm starting to wonder, ooh, do I need to go back and edit a lot of these pieces? Because I talk about my own experience with some mysticism and some spiritual things that happened not long after my daughter died. And in fact, it's a little bit strange. I didn't even put this together. That this is actually the anniversary of her death date. August 19th is the day she did pass. So it's just kind of like, oh, are these big spiritual moments? Are these connecting the dots? Or is it just all chaos and there's no meaning making from it? And for me, I tend to not be in the chaos piece. Yes, we live in a world that is chaos, but to me, I do find there's meaning making for me individually in terms of why are these things standing out in my mind? Why is this important to me that I'm now realizing this connection with this date? Is it just for my own self-help and healing, or is there something bigger there? So personally, that's where I go with some of these questions. And it always is like there's something kind of more outside of myself. There's always something beyond and something mystic in a way that I just don't know. And I realize I don't know high levels of science either that can adjust for these sorts of things or prove certain things. But I do see there is oftentimes an intersection of how science and spirituality can go hand in hand and open us up to more creative solutions and more diverse perspectives. And so I think it's hard because you have that end, but then you also have the end where people tend to harm others because of religion or spiritual things. So it is such a tricky point because along that spectrum, it's like, where do you enter in? One, with your own personal beliefs and just how you live day to day, but also as a coach and how you support your clients navigating these big questions too. And I think that is where I open up to the mystery. I just love that word. And I was first exposed to that word from a woman here in the community. She used to run My Baby Angel Foundation, and she was very active in the kind of infant loss community. And people could, reach out nationwide, and she would send these prints, and they were just beautiful. And it's like wrapped in the arms of the great mystery or something. And that's what she would always say. We don't know. It's just part of the mystery. And so I like that word because it allows me individually to have the access point from a scientific lens, from a spiritual lens, from all the different lenses, as I continue to explore that part of my being and thinking and feeling. And so that's another question too, right? Like I just said, the being, the thinking, and the feeling, right? And those are all things we look at in coaching and help our clients create movement with in various ways. And so again, spirituality naturally will come up in that space because of those four, and with the being in particular. So I would like, I guess this is a call to action, to see a little bit more guidance on some more creative approaches to how coaches integrate spirituality into their own practice, and how we talk about it in society, and how we're open to diverse viewpoints while also open to mystery. So kind of where I stand in a blended kind of professional and personal space. I grew up Catholic. I grew up with both the kind of traditional church faith tradition, but also, right, the mysteries of faith, the Mary having a strong presence, and a lot of these ritualistic type things, rosary, stations of the cross, those types of things, which created some structure. And then in college, I kind of moved away from that tradition due to various challenges that I encountered. And then I kind of have circled back, and this is something I'm just going to put myself out there. I circled back into, after Evelyn died, exploring various things, mostly rooting back into Christian because that's what I know, right? And then the Baha'i faith as well, and looking at a lot of their practices. And I think that is such a hard thing sometimes when you're trying to look for the spiritual lens that maybe you most align with and want to have some level of faith tradition in, and then struggle to find that, but then also have kind of like a broken path to get there, and then kind of settle on something that seems to be a mashup of the beliefs that you can at least feel aligned with in some ways. And that's not a good answer. That's my personal answer. I would never tell a coaching client to like that piece. But I think it's sometimes really hard to get out of a certain overarching tradition, right? Or overarching faith. And I have, like I said, found a lot of really invaluable faith leaders in the Christian tradition that have brought me peace and comfort. I mentioned Parker Palmer and Carrie Newcomer. I'm a big fan of Richard Rohr. He is doing a lot of cool things with the Center for Contemplative Action, and his emails are just so thought provoking. And so I find a little bit of solace in that. So I kind of rambled on various points, but it's just kind of like that's the other thing, this is coming from the heart and the mind. It may not be as cerebral as some of my other conversations that I've had on this podcast, which makes sense. So what about you, LaShawn?
I love that you said the mystery, because I think that is kind of a neutral term, and it acknowledges that we don't know all the answers. And I think that's one of the most important things about faith and hope. I believe that those two terms are rooted in the idea that we don't have all the answers. And there is this surrendering to the mystery. I think that is inherent in those two words, faith and hope. And I think spirituality is the part of us that cannot be explained, the part that's felt and experienced, but it isn't something that can be quantified, because that goes into science. But then if you look at like quantum physics and you look at metaphysics and you look at the like kind of higher level theoretical branches of science, it kind of passes into the realm of spirituality and mysticism and mystery. I think that there can be that experience in science as well, that awe, that sense of not knowing and not being able to understand, but the faith that you might not understand, but others, that come after you might find the answer. And we didn't know what microorganisms were. We didn't understand how, viruses caused us to be sick. And we explained it with the story that made sense to us at the time, which was mythology, which was the, being attacked, being cursed. I think we are explaining maybe similar things with the different terms and language that we have based on our understanding. And I think the more that we understand, and science is touching on some things that were once understood by the spiritual realm, like, for example, they are beginning to see how meditation affects the brain and what happens when, master meditators, that they're actually changing the environment of their brain and their body through meditation, the power of the mind, the power of suggestion. It's all kind of melding together and coming together. I love where you said mystery and how that can be a kind of neutral ground where we can maybe bridge between people who have different faiths or different denominations. Like, so if you're, for example, Muslim and Christian, they can come together in that neutral territory of mystery. They understand, experience, and explain the mystery differently, but where they do meet, and where any religion or any faith practice or spiritual practice meets, is the idea of mystery and making meaning, as you have said so eloquently, the meaning making that comes with spirituality. But I also think that there's also going back to previous episodes, there's this sense of surrender to the unknown and to the mystery in faith and spirituality, especially with faith, because faith is believing something without the evidence without evidence, basically. It's letting go of the need to know. I don't know if this is true, but I have faith that it is, or I have faith that this is going to happen, or that there is a benevolent higher power out there. It's not all chaos, that there is, goodness or wellness underneath. I think that it also brings comfort as well. And I think that's where faith, religion, and spirituality can show up in our lives as a source of comfort when we are faced with grief and loss and losing not just a loved one, but a home, or when things happen to us that are out of our control. For example, we lose our job, or we lose our house, or we are in a situation where there's a war, or when we have to flee and leave everything behind. One way to show care is by saying to the person that you are thinking of them, or you're praying for them. And I think that is a place, spirituality, faith, hope, religion, those are places where we do show care. And I think that it, like you said, it could hurt, but it could also help as well. Because I think when we say, I will pray for you, or I'm there for you, or I'm thinking of you, I think that is also an acknowledgement that I don't know why this happened to you, and I'm not even going to presume to know why this happened or why this unfortunate incident has happened. And I am like holding for you this sense of better days or comfort, where in the face of something so big or overwhelming, that sometimes is all we can do. And so I want to acknowledge that as well, that we do use faith, spirituality, religion, those terms of showing care do come from our religion. They do come from our faith practices, traditions. If you look at how we as Americans who have a foundation of Christianity, when someone has a loss, we do say our condolences, but we often say you're in our prayers or we're praying for you. And that comes from a faith tradition of Christianity. But there are other places where, if you look at like namaste, for example, that is a spiritual greeting. It's the acknowledgement of our oneness, our connection. Different meditations and mantras that come from Buddhism that are actually wishes or hope for humanity, for all living beings to be at peace. That show of care, that human show of care, does come from those traditions. That's something that's come up for me as well. How about you, Eryn? Anything coming up for you?
Yeah, I think with that care coming from faith tradition, sometimes that can be soothing, and it can also be a challenge if there's a history of church trauma or a history of family conflict related to these issues. So it does get a little bit tricky, I feel like, in the grief and loss space with that show of care. But what I do like is how you talked about it, because what you said is beyond that, right? It's whether it's in the Christian faith, the Buddhist faith, whatever it may be, there is this commonality that we are all human and that we all want what's best for one another. And that is the sentiment that I got from you and the way that you were relaying that. And I think that that is so true and comforting. And when we can hear that and receive that support and be open to receiving that, as well as sharing that, I think it does matter, even like you said, if it's not action, right? It's words, it's sentiments, and sometimes we do need action, but sometimes that's not the case. And those sentiments and words that are uplifting can be very powerful for putting more love out into the world. And I like how you talked about that there. And I just also want people to know, like, if they've experienced church trauma or trauma with their faith, that I can honor that complexity. And there are other ways that we can make sure that you are receiving the love and the loving kindness that is meant to come to you as well. We circling in on a coaching nugget of wisdom here. LaShawn, did you want to add something?
No, if you want to go ahead and drop that coaching nugget of wisdom, please do.
Okay, yeah. So I think for my coaching nugget of wisdom, I guess it's going to be a two-part. One, for individuals, be open to the mystery and engage with that. And also, two, from a coaching practice and a coaching lens, do the same. See how this changes your practice and hopefully makes it more effective for your clients.
And I would add to that, as we're doing in this conversation, I invite you to look at where religion, spirituality, faith shows up in your life. Where are there some points of contention or maybe even reluctance to venture into that area? Where does religion, faith, spirituality give you comfort? And where do you see it playing out in your life and even in your profession, even if you're not a coach? Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm LaShawn with Mayshell Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.